planning, or so orchestration for interactive score. What
Yeah.
tips have you got for us there?
Well, actually, I'm going to do the planning first because I've got
sure.
a few images here. And actually, this kind of follows on from what you've been saying, Alan. One of our in-house composers, Jim, created this spreadsheet. Basically, you just fill in what you want, and it tells you how much it's going to cost you. And it does cover everything. It covers the studio, if you are doing doubling and things, like that, which is a kind of premium soloing. It has all the current MU rates for everything, contingency, and quickly you can go, right, that's where we're going. That's what it's going to be. And actually, if you find out it's double your budget, you can go, right, okay. And it's just a quick way of because doing these sums, as Alan said, 8 minutes an hour and all this kind of stuff. So there's a bit at the top where you can add, what sessions you're doing and things like that. And it's easily, to manage and get a figure out. Otherwise, it's quite complex to, manipulate this sort of things, especially on the interactive side where you're not necessarily going, right, all the orchestras in at once, where you're doing like getting in certain people and really having to plan and manage the sessions quite cleverly to maximize your budget, essentially. What other points have I got? Yeah, but also kind of just want to sort of backtrack a bit as well. To the kind of concept of when you're writing music and just how do you know how many instruments you want, how many players you want? That all comes obviously from the creative. So everything goes hand in hand, the creative, the planning, the budget. Can you record the whole lot live, or do you have to do some hybrid approach? Do you just want to do some solo stuff? But I mean, this all depends on the actual creative and the content of it, really. But also, on the planning side is booking a studio, whether it's in this country or in Eastern Europe or wherever, really, is these places, there's not actually that many of them, and they get booked up. And a number of times, our preferred one is Air Studios up in Hampstead. You have to, and that falls on relationships. You have to have those relationships with the studios and that, and they will kind of do you favors to get you in the studio when you want, and the nature of game development can be quite fluid. It can often be a little bit flying at the seat of your pants of like, we've got to book it 6 months in advance. I think a lot of this comes from experience as well, but really tightly planning when you're going to do, and actually you have to commit, otherwise you will lose the slot in a studio. You will lose your preferred musicians working with an orchestral contractor. And actually, following on from the last point, if you are doing multiple sessions, say, for one particular game, but they may be a year apart, and this is something we've just done recently, for various reasons. Obviously, you want to have the same players because they're familiar with the music, but obviously, budgetary reasons, having the same players, it means it's that combined usage fee. You are just paying those players. Any different players, that's on top of that, and that kind of pushes your budget right out. So it's really being clever and working and having that relationship with the orchestral contractor as well, and knowing what you want. And when it comes to the interactive side, the musicians, they get it. They don't really necessarily know the ins and outs, but you've got to work early with the conductor as well. Get them involved and say, right, this is what we're doing, and make them understand why you're kind of doing, only certain people in the room at once, or just your kind of outlook on why you're recording while you are, because it's not a linear film, which they may be used to. So they're comfortable and not kind of asking questions and going, well, this is, we're getting...
So do they need to understand something of how it will be used in the game?
Definitely the conductor, and having that kind of... He's the kind of middleman through the glass, essentially, to the musicians. And if he knows exactly what you're doing, he can quickly message that to the musicians. And, because I think sometimes they might think, we're kind of doubling here and doing some crazy stuff which we shouldn't be, but you got to just be really kind of mindful of that of that kind of thing, really. So I guess I'll move on to some sort of orchestration. One of the projects we did a good few years ago was, as I mentioned earlier, was like music through a couple of 100 years of history, and it's like, okay, you don't want to be sort of having a different size orchestra for the different cues and getting really crazy like that. So we really kind of had worked on actually the orchestration, what instruments are relevant for these cues, and really working with those instruments, adding the colours of what was appropriate for the time, etc. And one big thing is actually how you record, setting up the mic placements and how that's going to sound. This is just what, in the hall at Air Studios, we like to try a few different things and how to actually capture what we wanted, but be able to manipulate that sound as well to create greater depth, bigger reverb, all sorts of things. It's thinking about the recording sessions as well of what you want to achieve from your creative. And more often than not, this is a sort of I guess a standard thing that some people do when they're doing stems for interactivity. You kind of split the different sections apart, but actually that doesn't really bear much on the musical content. And so kind of thinking about the orchestration of how the musically it will work together, you may simply just split it like this. So you've got woodwinds and first violins they're the melodic side of it. So will you do them in the same stem? You wouldn't split them off. It's really just being a bit more thoughtful about it. And this is an example we did as well. So from a book of spells, 3 layers, but the layer that always played was a harmonic layer. It had the harmonic content. You were always it made musical sense when nothing else was playing. Sometimes if you're playing with different layers and things, it's like you've got to be careful. It might not make musical sense and just get a bit. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, what often happens, I suppose it depends on whether you sort of see it as a sort of, what you're doing is a kind of musical challenge, or does it start with the technology and you're just sort of tailoring the content to fit the system? I think, I think they do go hand. I mean, you have to consider. It does have an effect on the content, doesn't it? I mean, how you play back the music. I mean, you've got to if you're going to do things that way, if you're going to stem stuff, and if you're going to have a stem that needs to function by itself, then you're going to have to compose to make that happen. Yeah. But sometimes that's going to challenge the musicality of the whole piece. So there's a fine line. I know it's not. It relates more to your first point actually, but you just sort of got me thinking about that. Yeah. I think you do have to sort of. I mean, I think the music is king, when it comes to that. And then you think about the technology and how you stem it and how you sort of reduce it, because music's not always reducible in the first place, So, if you just sort of mute an entire section of the orchestra, you've got if you're just going to have strings, then a piece of music doesn't always work in that way, so that one section of the orchestra will function by itself, unless of course you've specifically composed it to do that. So yes. It's not, you can't assume that every orchestral piece of music can be successfully stemmed and still work.
No, that's a great point.
Or be musical.
And that presumably has led you at times to maybe do completely alternative takes of the whole orchestra. But at different, so if you want different intensities,
yeah, I mean, I reckon
a
better approach than stemming, I find anyway, is to have a few pieces of music that are harmonically connected, but at different recorded at different dynamic levels, or a different take. So you have an underlying sort of structure or chord progression, but you have, that to put it crudely, they're cross-fadeable, but they do different things, if you like. Yeah. So you can have this effect of an entire piece of music growing out of another one, but they're still separately composed pieces of music, rather than thinking of a piece of music as something you reduce to bits.
Do you think there's an inherent tension then between the whole concept of, layers and all of that, with musicality.
I think there can be, but it depends on what you're doing, you know, and why you're doing it.
Yes.
And I think music, it's a music, you know, we need a musical solution first.
Yes.
And you know, it depends on what the game needs.
Well,
And I don't think we should be led by the technology and to say we have a system, it needs this, and then you just kind of contrive it.
Yeah.
I mean, that will work, but will it be as musical? You know, if the piece of music is doing the same thing, you know, it's always combat music, it's always exploration music. It's very simplistic because music in the real world, I mean, generally music doesn't operate like that. You have a lot of light and shade within a piece of music. It changes in tone, color, texture. Throughout that piece, it has a narrative.
Yeah.
But when you hand the music over to a system, narrative is being driven by the system.
Yeah.
So if you can do that effectively, that's fine. But I think the music is key. And it goes back to Alistair's first point about don't overcook things.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, now let's take a look at some footage of you and Alan in action. Can you tell us what we're going to see?
I think it's just going to be a couple of excerpts from sort of behind-the-scenes video that Jagex made covering the process of replacing, recording orchestral renditions of some of the older RuneScape music and adding some new, and it sort of raises a few questions about recording in different locations. It's just a glimpse into the...
The orchestra itself is called the Slovak National Symphony Orchestra. The lineup we have here today is a full string section of 14 first violins, 12 seconds, 10 viola, 8 cello and 6 basses, which is a really, really good size for a string section. And to complement that, we have a fairly large brass section. We have 6 French horns. Over there we have 3 trumpets, 3 trombones and a tuba. And then we have the regular symphonic woodwind section, which is 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets and 2 bassoons. First class, world class. There's 2 elements that you can never replace electronically, and that's soul and spirit. And that's what you get from a live orchestra playing live and being re-recorded live.
It's a real humbling experience to hear pure musicianship playing. There's no electronics, there's no correcting things. It's just musicians that have dedicated their lives to their instruments, and the whole sound is just magical.
We wanted to retain the original spirit of the RuneScape music, but we wanted the quality and the production to be really bumped up to the next level.
What better way than to record the Philharmonia at Abbey Road?
The reason we went to Abbey Road is quite simply because it has one of the best spaces in the world for recording an orchestra. It sounds so rich, so lush. You'll hear it in many soundtracks. It has a very distinctive sound.
The orchestra we have here today is a really big orchestra, about 80 players, 50 plus strings. It's a wonderful, wonderful sound.
I think the vibe in the whole studio is like this kind of excited what's coming next.
It's like the music comes alive off of the page and the notes get a life of their own. The players themselves putting everything into it.
This kind of funny music even, I mean, you want to smile about this because you think like you could almost imagine that what's going on in the video game, and you get yourself actually hungry about, oh, I want to see this video game, I want to play it now.
The music is so intense, so exciting and so powerful. It's going to drive the player through the game.
A round of applause. And thank you to Jagex for that footage, who are represented here today. I see 2 of the stars of that video right there. Thanks, guys. Sounds amazing. So one thing you touch on there is like choice of venue. Now, obviously, that's going to be presumably partly down to economics, although presumably a lesser consideration than choice of orchestra. But yeah, can you talk about what criteria drives your choice of venue for recording?
Choice of venue or that and choice of orchestra, because they kind of, I suppose it goes hand in hand, really.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Go on, talk about that.
Well, I mean, I do think that can I start with the orchestra?
Yeah.
I think you do have to consider where you're going to record. You do have to match the music to the orchestra that you want to use. I mean, I know in theory, you wouldn't necessarily expect that, but I mean, if you want to record kind of virtuoso, very technically difficult music, something like Harry Potter or very, very fiddly music that you need to record quite a bit of fairly quickly, then I think probably nowhere else but London to do that. So I think sometimes you do sort of tailor your music to where you plan on realizing it. But yeah, that does relate to the space as well. I mean, the size of the orchestra. I think I'm right in thinking that Abbey Road Studio 1, you need 50 strings really to make. To make the most of that space. Yeah. So I mean, you don't have to record in a enormous room like that. So it depends on your lineup. So it's just important to match your musical content with the size of the ensemble, the effect you're after, and where you record the sound of the room itself. I mean, air is very, very warm. I mean, if you record some scoring stages in the States, to my ears, it sounds, you end up with something a lot drier. They tend to close mic things. You don't hear as much of the room. And it's very subjective as well. People are very used to the sound of somewhere like Abbey Road because it's used in film so often.
Good. Okay, we're running a little bit behind time, so let's race on. Alan, I'd like to come back to you for our next sort of key tip.